Our next speaker today is Kerry Muhlestein. Professor Muhlestein is professor of ancient scripture in the Faculty of Religious Education at BYU. He received his bachelor and master's degree from BYU and a PhD in Egyptology from UCLA. His first full-time appointment was a joint position in religion and history at BYU, Hawaii. He is the director of the BYU Egyptian Project and has served as the vice president of the Society for the Study of Egyptian Antiquities. He and his wife, Julianne, are parents of 6 children and together have lived in Jerusalem on several occasions while Professor Muhlestein taught there. An interesting sidelight about Kerry. He completed the final dive for his scuba certification. So he's a scuba diver by diving in the underwater ruins of Caesarea in Israel. Professor Muhlestein.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get the screen up. While we do that, I want to thank Dr. Ricks, who's one of my former teachers, for inviting me to be here. And I'm also mindful of the fact that when I was hired, maybe I'll put it this way, when Kent Brown retired, I was hired into that slot, and it's a legacy I know I won't ever live up to, but that I hope not to tarnish too terribly. It's been good to hear from him, and it's good to be with all of you, although it's very bright as I look up. It's hard to see everyone because the lights are so bright. And hopefully this is coming on soon. There we go. In any case, today we'll talk about Egyptian temples, and an aspect of Egyptian temples that is often not talked about, but that I find to be fascinating. We'll have to move through this very quickly. So as we talk about temples in Egypt, let's just be clear, we're going to barely touch the surface even of the subject I'd like to talk about today, and that's for a number of reasons. One, there are changes over time in a number of ways, whether we're going to talk about changes from going to tents with skins and poles to stone buildings, or whether we're going to talk about temples that were built literally over a period that lasts longer than 1,000 years. We have to remember that we are talking about a temple system that lasted and evolved for over 3,000 years. And so anything we talk about will just be general. I will try and focus on one specific time period for the most part, which is the Ptolemaic era, or when the Greeks were ruling Egypt. About 300 BC is about when this would start. But most of what I will talk about is generally applicable to all of Egyptian history. I should emphasize that even the rituals changed over time, and the rituals we'll talk about today come from the most part from that later time period. We're also going to just barely touch on the idea that there's a difference between rituals for the living as opposed to the dead. There are at least two types of temples in Egypt. One is for temples that are dedicated to gods, and then there are temples dedicated to pharaohs in the hereafter. And most of what we'll talk about is for the divine temples, but there are applications for the mortuary temples as well. So again, this is we're just touching on the greatest of generalities as we're together today. Often as we talk about sacred aspects of temples, we talk about sacred space, and that is completely appropriate and very important. But what we often don't talk about is sacred time. And there are a few elements of sacred time we could talk about. So for example, that many rituals, probably all rituals, were governed by the appropriate time to perform them, whether that be the daily sacrifices that Dr. Brown talked about at the Temple of Herod, or all temples had daily sacrifices, or festival sacrifices that took place at specific times that were determined by the movements of stars and so on. That's an important aspect of sacred time, but that's actually not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about the idea that in the temple you were able to return to a specific time that in a way was really outside of time, a time that or a series of events that happened before time began, we could say. In order to really understand that, we have to do just a brief background on Egyptian creation theology. And that's also a complex subject. There are a number of creation theologies, and they may seem contradictory to us, but to the Egyptians they would have just been different ways of representing different aspects and nuances and facets of what is an unexpressible and not fully understandable event, and that's the creation. We'll focus on the Heliopolitan creation theology, which really starts with the idea that before creation, everything was chaotic material, symbolized by watery chaos, and then something was able to create itself. That would be named Atum, who created himself, and then soon he had children, who had children, who had children, and that gives the basis of 9 created gods or goddesses known as the Ennead, and this is really in many ways represents the creation of the universe and the earth and Egypt, and they're the core creator deities in this particular creation theology. And it's important to understand that, to understand the time that they were trying to return back to, because in this period that we're talking about, they also had created man and they lived with man. Mankind was able to enjoy communion with deity. They were not yet separated. The texts speak about the time before mankind were cut off or separated from God. And that's what this time is. Then something happened that disturbed this state of affairs. There are a number of ways it's described. In this particular creation theology, it's described as Seth killing his brother Osiris. Osiris had become king of Egypt and the world and men, and Seth was jealous, and so he killed Osiris, and that disturbed the way things were supposed to be. Osiris was dead, but his wife and sister, Isis, was able to revive him in a way, not really fully to life, but to an afterlife. She saves his afterlife, his ability to exist. He will then become, instead of the king of the living, he will become the dead king, and over time that becomes the idea that he is also the king of the dead. She also is able to revive him enough that together they are able to beget a child, and that child's name is Horus. And Horus will become the new king on earth. It's a long story how that happens, but anyway, the new king on earth, and will represent mankind to the gods and gods to mankind. But another side effect of all of this is that once this chaotic sequence of events is introduced, because that perfect order has been interrupted, mankind is no longer in the presence of the gods. Texts speak of the gods withdrawing themselves to the heavens, and mankind is left here on earth with sometimes interactions with Horus. And that's the problem for them. While this is an interesting state, it's not necessarily the ideal state. Now, we have to ask ourselves, when did this happen? And the Egyptian phrase is septepi, the first time. Later, as they kind of get into creating it into a full-blown story, it will become Septeru, or the first day, but initially it's a time. It's a time before time began, a time before time is measured the way man measures, understands, and experiences time. That's a little hard to understand, but maybe we can explain it this way. If we were to say when time as we know it begins, it's like a play, and when the curtain goes up on the play, Septepi has already happened. So let me put it this way. By the time we get to see what happens and understand creation as we know it, the curtain has gone up and all of this story has already happened. It happened before time. And mankind is no longer with God, and we have all of this situation that's been created here. And that is the state that we live in as men, but it's not the state that they wanted. What they wanted was to be in the state where they were with deity as it was before, with one important difference. They didn't want to erase Horus, who came into existence as a part of all of this. And so it's not completely a desire to return to the time as it was, but to largely return to that time, but in a different state. And other temple systems, it would be the idea of returning to that time, but in a higher, holier state. So they want to get back to this time, but with a few key differences. Now, the question is then, how do you return to a time that is outside of time? How can you affect that? How can you make that happen? And there's really only one way for that to happen, and that is with ritual. Ritual is an activity that can both transcend space and time. It can have effect in this world, in the heavenly world, in the afterlife. It can have effect in time as we measure it, but in time before it was measured and began. And so ritual is the key, the way that you can recreate sacred time. And of course, that will happen in a sacred space like the temple. Now, there are two tasks for ritual in this regard, the idea of returning to sacred time. One will be to create or recreate order, that way that things were supposed to be. The Egyptian phrase is ma'at. And it will also be to destroy or hold at bay chaos, or the Egyptian word is isfet. And that's really what many of these rituals were aimed at doing, is to this twofold thing, to create order and destroy the chaos that was a threat to that order and disturbed that order in the first place. So we could spend several hours talking about the recreative aspects of temples, but again, that's not really it's even harder to see you now, but maybe that's more comfortable for me. I don't know. Anyway, maybe that's it's a topic for another day, but in any case, we ought to at least touch on the idea that just the architecture of the temple itself was designed to recreate the world as a form of recreation. The Shabaka stone has a text on it that appears to be a ritual drama of creation that's enacted in the temple as they enact temple through ritual drama. There were rituals that were designed to uphold or restore order, or Ma'at, personified here by the goddess Ma'at. That's an important part of what they did with these rituals. One really important aspect of this recreation then would be the idea that you could regain the presence of deity, which normally we were shielded from, but certain priests with certain ritual preparations could come to these doors that were sealed shut, and with the correct preparations and rituals could then open those doors and come into the presence of deity once again. That's really one of the primary aims of this recreative process. But today we're focusing on the destruction of chaos, but we need to understand the creation really to understand the destruction of chaos, and we'll talk in a moment about how they're tied together. We want to talk about the destruction of chaos. In some ways, again, this happened architecturally. As you approach a temple, you'll see these lines. The approach itself is lined by figures or beasts that are designed to scare away, we call it apotropaic, but to scare away any or prevent the approach of anything chaotic, anything that shouldn't be there, that doesn't belong there. There were gates and doors that you had to go through. Of course, these were always designed to only let in that which should go in and to keep chaos and chaotic elements out. That was done to some degree. These huge pylons had gates in them, and they had names. For example, Bechnet, vigilant. Others are the mistress of terror, and all sorts of exciting things like this designed to keep that chaos at bay, prevent chaos from coming into that sacred space, and thus from once again disrupting sacred time. And of course, there would be series of doors and pylons. Each one, as you go into more and more sacred space, you have yet another barrier that would prevent that which is chaotic from coming through. This is also reflected in the text for the afterlife, by the way, the same kind of idea. And you can see here depicted all sorts of gatekeepers with their knives and other things that will kill and beat away anything that does not belong there. Of course, on the walls, you also have depictions of the pharaohs winning their battles and then gathering their enemies and smiting them. This is, again, a way of creating in perpetuity, as these are carved onto the walls and still there today. In perpetuity, they are destroying and holding all chaotic forces at bay. So, for the most part, all these architectural features keep chaos out. The smiting scene, to some degree, begins the process of actually destroying whatever chaos already exists. But there would have to be more that would do this. So how do we destroy this chaos again? It's through ritual. Rituals must exist that can destroy this chaos, both in this realm and in other realms, and in this time and in things that transcend time. One of the primary, probably the primary ritual for this is what we call execration rites, a series of rites that hold a very, very long history in Egyptian religious thought. We'll only be able to briefly touch on it today, but it is the key to understanding many of these things. So the execration rites were designed to destroy anything that was rebellious or chaotic or dangerous. So we ask, how often did these things happen? Well, there were daily execration rites. As there were daily sacrifices, as Dr. Brown talked about, there were daily execration rites. There were also special execration rites that were parts of festivals. And of course, certain specific occasions could call forth the need for specific execration rites, both on a personal and on a global or at least Egyptian global level. What kinds of things did they use in these execration rites, we should ask ourselves? Well, they used figurines, statues, and statuettes that could be made of any number of things. They could be made of clay. These could have inscribed on them spells and the names of the people and forces that were supposed to be destroyed, although they were often blank as well. They could be made of clay or stone or wax or wood and probably other things that we're not aware of, but those are the things that we know about. They would often involve pots and bowls. You saw the photo I had up earlier of a smashed pot with writing on it that was part of Dr. Gee's hieroglyphic class, if I remember correctly, where they would learn the execration spell and then experience, well, I don't know that they experienced the whole thing, but at least the smashing part. So pots and bowls. Papyrus often is supposed to be a new papyrus written with green ink and so on, but papyrus that could have things inscribed on it. Hairballs, and again, probably other things that haven't survived archaeologically and that aren't attested in the text, but these are at least the things that we know about. All of these were in one way or another destroyed. Now, who were the targets of the rite? Who were they trying to destroy? Personal enemies could be the targets of these rites. Political enemies, and that could be actual people or entire countries. Military enemies, again, countries and armies and specific individuals that represented a military threat. And of course, supernatural enemies were included in these rites. So for example, a spell that is designed to be for the felling of the enemies of Re, Horus, and Pharaoh. All right, so this will include supernatural and real life political and military enemies. Often, in fact, the rituals were designed to combine all kinds of enemies so that you would get both political and supernatural, such as saying it will destroy every foe of Re and every foe of Pharaoh. And so these rituals are designed to have effect, again, in both this realm and other realms. And they were often going to destroy them, whether they were dead or alive, because they still existed in the afterlife. And this may be a little over the top for us in our political system, or at least our judicial system, but everyone who is even accused would be part of this rite, and their families. I didn't write the ritual, that's just how it went. So now we ask the question, who could perform this ritual? Well, we don't really know. There are certainly times and abilities for the common man to have this ritual performed. We don't know, did they always employ a priest, or did they feel that they could do this in their home for certain things themselves? We really don't know that. But as far as formal rites, especially in the temples and other settings, we know that priests performed these rituals. And just as an example, we know one of the kinds of priests that would perform this is the prophet of men who massacres his enemies. That's of particular interest to us because the priest who owned the papyrus that has facsimile 1 on it was a prophet of men who massacres his enemies. So he was someone who would perform these kinds of rituals. We ask, where were these performed? Well, they could be performed in any number of places. We have many examples of them in cemeteries, examples of them at military installations. My guess would be that they happened in homes and other places, but that's archaeologically and textually difficult to attest. But the ones we know the most about are those that happened in temples. For example, at the temple of Edfu, at a court that's surrounded by 32 columns, its name is the place in which Seftech is defeated, the enemy of Herakte. And so the name of this courtyard suggests that one of the main things that happened in the courtyard were these execration rites. We know of them happening at the Temple of Mut at Karnak and the Montu Temple. It probably happened in every temple. We know about it for certain at many temples, and some, especially something like Montu, because the nature of the god worship there probably happened more frequently than in the other temples. Now we ask ourselves, what was done in these execration rites? Well, many of them were aimed at a character named Apophis, which you can read there. Apophis is a giant snake who is chaos, or Isfet, incarnate. In many ways, he represents all chaotic elements in the universe, and so he would often be the primary target of these rituals. And many of the rituals said that you would write his name in green ink on a new papyrus and so on. So let's just look at, we can't go into everything that happened, but we can look at a few specific examples. So we know of some rites that took place within a specific daily ritual. One is the spell of spitting on Apophis, and then the spell of trampling on Apophis, and then the spell of taking a spear to Apophis, and the spell of binding Apophis, and the spell of taking the knife to Apophis. You can see they will leave nothing undone. The spell of setting fire to Apophis, and the spell of smashing Apophis. All right, so these are all separate rituals within the larger ritual. They are very serious about this. We know at other places, not in the specific one I was just looking at it, but other times and places, the ritual would include smashing pots, melting things, urinating on those things, decapitating various figurines, burying these things, and so on. It could take all sorts of forms, but these are forms that we know about. Now let's look at some specific language within one of those rituals. We had the list of rituals. We'll look at some things that happen within one of those rituals. They were to bind the image with a sinew of a red cow, and then spit on him 4 times, and trample on him with your left foot, then smite him with a spear, slaughter him with a knife, place him on the fire, spit on him in the fire many, many times. All right, so that's just one ritual that they would do as they were trying to destroy these chaotic elements. Now, I want to make it clear, these rituals destroyed the chaotic forces that perpetuated the introduction of chaos in Septepi. Right? They also destroyed things that were happening in this realm and in this time, but part of the aim is to get rid of the very forces that had caused problems to begin with. Now, that brings us to an interesting tie that I've noticed as I've studied these execration rituals, is that very frequently there is a tie between the idea of creating and destroying. One often has to accompany the other. You'll see this, for instance, in texts about the journey of the sun. You can see here the sun incarnate as it's journeying to be born again, and that's a creation motif. At the dawn of the day, the sun as it comes forth, that's recreation. That's a creation motif. But you'll notice below him is this terrible snake that is a danger to him. And you see Horus there spearing this snake to destroy him, because in the journey to create, you must destroy that which would prevent the perfect creation or recreation. So let's look at a couple of examples of this on a particular papyrus, Papyrus Bremner, Rhindi, which is now housed in the British Museum. We'll look at, first of all, just the makeup of this papyrus in general. It has 4 specific, what we would call books or different texts on it. One are the songs of Isis and Nephthys. Those are the 2 sisters of Osiris who saved his existence after he was killed, and then Isis was impregnated to give birth to Horus, and so that becomes one of the primary symbols of this. Procreation becomes a symbol of creation or recreation. So procreation and recreation in this story are very significantly tied together. There's the ritual of bringing Sokar, which is also a ritual with heavy creation and recreation motifs. And then the next book is the book of Overthrowing Apophis. And the book of the names of Apophis, who shall not be. You have to put that on there. We want to make sure that we're noting he won't exist when this is done. And so you see that on this papyrus, all of these texts are combined. They're not combined into the same ritual, but they seem to belong together. Let's look at some examples of creation and destruction being tied together in the songs of Isis and Nephthys. The greater portion of this text reviews or is about the reviving of Osiris so that Horus can be begotten. As I said, that's a procreative/creative ritual. Let's look at specifically in column 2, lines 10 or 9 through 10. where they ask for him to come, Isis and Nephthys ask for Osiris to come and consort with us after the manner of a male so that the procreation can happen. And the next line is that Tebcha, a destructive or chaotic force, will go to his execution block. And then it speaks for a little while about the execution of Tebcha, to get rid of the destructive force in the midst of this creative process. As we continue this particular book in column 3, which was on this picture, but I put up a different picture for you here. Anyway, column 3, lines 25 through columns 4, line 7. They say, "O Osiris, bull of the west," a phrase that denotes his fertility and thus his procreative abilities. "Come thou to the two widows," again talking about the procreation. And then the next thing it says is, "They," the other gods of the Aeneid, "ward off Seth for thee when Re administers the punishment of the rebellious." Right? So he can come for this or creative act only if they are warding off the destructive forces. If we continue further in this spell, Isis will sing to Osiris, "Ho, thou youth, come in peace. Ho, thou brother of mine, come thou to thine house without fear." And then it says just this: "The great rite of protection, unseen, unheard," seeming to indicate that at this point, a protective rite that would then be a destructive rite is performed. If we go to one of the books that focus on, that's all from a book that focuses on creation. If we go to a book that focuses on destruction, we get a very long section that has all sorts of things you're supposed to do to get rid of Apophis, kind of entertaining stuff. And then it finishes with this: "Apophis is brought to the flame, Neki is brought to the fire, and he shall be utterly non-existent. Be annihilated, O Apophis," and you say that 4 times. "And this is to be recited over an image of Apophis made with a waxen body and drawn on a new sheet of papyrus, to be put in the fire before Re every day." And the next line says, "The book of knowing the creations of Re and of felling Apophis." And it ties the idea of creation and destruction together again. And we see this repeated so often. Again, this idea that creation and destruction must be tied together. And the question is, why? And the answer really is that you have to overcome the disturbance so that you can re-achieve that pristine state where God and man are reunited. But of course, not the original pristine state, a pristine state that's even better. That in this case has Horus with it, but in other systems just better in a number of ways. So, as I said, this includes then that reunion with deity, so that the idea is that when chaos is destroyed and order is upheld, you can go through the doors, and in the temples you are briefly reunited with the presence of deity, although we know from the funerary literature that they hoped that in the afterlife that would be more than a brief, but a full and permanent reunion. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions, and now I can even see you to know if you're asking questions. So, yes, and I think they're probably bringing a mic somewhere. But
so as I listen to your presentation, and I'm getting echoes of dualism here: creation, destruction, and then I start to think about this almost in the scapegoat rite a little bit. There's something that kind of is analogous to what I'm hearing here, and so are you seeing things like that? What kind of observations are you seeing from that?
This pairing is not unique to Egyptian temple systems. I think we have more documentation of it from Egyptian temple systems than anywhere else. But I think you're right, and you point out a very interesting parallel. In the ritual in which Israel is symbolically reunited for that brief moment with deity, part of that is that the bad or destructive forces of Israel must be carried away. And over time, we know the tradition is that they drive the scapegoat off a cliff so that it dies and can't come back to them, right? And so it really is a kind of an execration rite that's associated with the ability to be reunited with deity. And so I do think that you see that idea in many places. So we'll go here, and I thought I saw a question over here, but maybe I was wrong.
Okay, in Genesis, in King James Version, we have the son of the woman bruising the serpent's head. In the Latin Vulgate, we have the woman crushing the serpent's head. So, of course, we got Mary in the Catholic version, and in the Protestant version, we have Christ. I don't know which one is the correct, probably.
Probably both.
But anyway, so the translation of crushing the serpent's head is probably more accurate than bruising the serpent's head, I guess.
And you just make a comment, or?
The Hebrew is stronger than bruising.
Good. And again, I would note then that what you have is this strong tradition in a number of cultures that snakes, while they often can represent good, and sometimes snakes protect the sun in the Egyptian thought from the bad snakes. So you get good and bad snakes, just like you have the snake on the pole for Israelite tradition, yet in the Garden of Eden story, it is the snake that represents that chaos that drives man and God apart. And so I think you're right, there's an important similarity there, and the expressed is that idea that you have to destroy the snake. So you're right.
Are there any groups or any people that that continue these rituals, and if not, like try to revive them? These are probably ancient, but if not, when did they end?
Great question. So, I can't say that there aren't any, because there are always some weird group somewhere who tries to revive something Egyptian in very strange ways. So probably someone somewhere does it. But Egyptian religion itself really dies out as Christianity comes into Egypt. And so you're going to see these rituals in a way ending in, say, 3rd or 4th century. But what you find is that they find just different ways that they're continued, so that even today, after the inhabitants of Egypt have gone through from this early Egyptian religion to Christian to Muslim religion, there are still traditions today. For example, at New Year's, people will, and I think they have no idea where these traditions come from, but there's a tradition that they take some of their plates and bowls and throw them out the window and break them as a way of starting the new year. And they probably think of this as just kind of a celebration thing, but really you can trace this back several thousand years. So there are manifestations of them, and who knows, there's probably some weird group somewhere that's really trying to be Egyptian. I don't know.
Splattering the glasses when Mazel tov.
Yeah, I haven't looked into whether that's connected or not. Her question is whether, at weddings and so on, smashing bottles and glasses. I would have to look into whether that's connected or not. I don't know. It's a good question. So I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, sir.
So what I found really interesting about this was to view, I guess, temple ritual not from the standpoint of purity and impurity, but from the standpoint of order and chaos. Do you find, because from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, that's really how we would view temple rituals, did the Egyptians have a concept of like purity and impurity that was at the level of how they viewed order and chaos? Was it synonymous?
Well, so whether they're synonymous or not, I'll get to in just a second. They absolutely have an idea of purity and impurity, and Dr. Gee, who you'll hear from later today, has written about this extensively, and his dissertation was on this topic. And so if I don't say yes, he will throw something at me. But I happen to agree with him. It's hugely important. Now, my Egyptology colleagues are probably laughing because I tend to see almost everything in Egyptian religion connected in one way to another to this idea of order and chaos and the competition between the two. And so I will say this, and he'll have his chance later to rebut me, Dr. Gee will, but in my view, ritual purity is a way of trying to establish the correct order. And in a way getting rid of disorder by whether it be washing or anointing and other things that they do. It's a way of getting rid of that which you shouldn't have and creating the state that you should have, which to me always speaks of destroying chaos, upholding order. I may be prone to see that everywhere, and so maybe I'm just crazy on that. But I think that ritual purity is a way of doing this same thing. So thank you very much.